The last thing I want to talk about with respect to line art is adding color to your digital line art in Illustrator. Now, if you remember way back to the beginning of the first video in this series, I said that the big advantage of black and white line art is that it reproduces so easily in print. You're talking about a high contrast medium with just solid black lines printed on white paper. Reproduces very easily on an offset press. It reproduces very easily on inexpensive office copy equipment such as a photocopier. As soon as you add color, you lose that advantage of easy print reproduction, because you're no longer talking about just printing solid black lines on paper. Now you're talking about printing multiple colors of ink, and these inks have to be printed using a halftone pattern in order to create lighter tints of the different colored printing inks. For example, if I select the outline of this person on the left and you look at the color palette, you'll see that the fill color is 15% magenta, 15% yellow. If I look at the stroke color, you'll see that it's a mixture of magenta, yellow, and black. So to print this image, we would need at least 3 different printing plates for those 3 printing colors of ink. And the things that are not 100%, in fact, there's nothing in here that's 100% solid ink. These are all lighter values of magenta, yellow, and black. So there would have to be halftone screens for all 3 colors of ink, which just makes printing this image just as challenging as printing any other full color image where you'd have to generate halftones. So why would you add color to your line art images if you lose that ease of printing in black and white? Well, of course, if your client is asking for a full color image, then you're kind of obligated to provide something to them in color. But why not just draw it using the pen tool, as you see here on the left? Why go to the trouble of drawing outlines, converting those strokes to outlines, to outline shapes, merging them all together, and then going to the trouble of making variable line weights and adding snodgrasses and tapering the ends of the lines, as you see in the image here on the right? And I'm hoping that the answer to that is kind of obvious. Pretty simple. I just think that the artwork with the variable line weights looks better. The artwork with the uniform line weights that's just drawn directly with the pen tool, I think has a bit of a stiff mechanical appearance to it. Whereas the artwork on the right with variable line weights has a more natural, organic appearance to it. And I think that natural, organic look is especially important if you're illustrating things like the human figure or internal organs, which of course are natural, organic objects. So whenever I need to create an illustration of the human figure or a bone or an organ or any other organic object like that, I will typically go to the trouble of drawing a variable line weight version. Earlier in my career, I would do this by actually creating a pen and ink drawing and converting it using image trace. Now I would more likely use the outline stroke method. So let me show you how to add color to your digital line art. So here you see a rectangle on the left, and this is something that I demonstrated in one of the earlier videos. This is actually drawn directly in Photoshop and saved as a JPEG and then placed here into Illustrator. So this is actually a raster image that's been placed into Illustrator. I want to show you that there's a difference in the way you add color to something that's created using the image trace method, where you would scan and convert a raster image into vectors, versus using the outline stroke method, which I'll show in just a minute. So I've selected this JPEG of the square that was drawn in Photoshop. I'm going to go to the Object menu, Image Trace, and make and expand. And then I need to delete that background object, and I have my vector shapes. And as you can see, when I select the larger square in the background, it's black. When I select the white square in the center, it's white. So it's very, very easy to add color to something that you've converted using image trace. You just select the white shape in the center and give it a color. You can also select the black shape and give that a color as well. So very easy to do. Now let me show you that it's a little bit more challenging, a little bit more difficult when you use the outline strokes method. So I'm going to just draw a rectangle using the regular rectangle tool. And I'm going to give this a fill color of none and give it a black stroke so that it looks very much like the raster square image that I started with in the image trace example. So I'm going to now go to the Object menu, Path, Outline Stroke. So that has converted this into a black shape. And I look here in my color palette, and of course it confirms that it's a black shape. Now if I select only on the outer black square, you'll see that it shows up as black, no surprise. But what might be surprising is when I select the inner white square, it also shows up as black. When I outline the stroke of an enclosed object like this, or if I had outlined a whole bunch of separate strokes, but then merged them all together using the Pathfinder tool, if there was any kind of enclosed area like the interior of this square, Illustrator treats that as a hole inside that black square. Let me show you something similar. If I were to draw a solid black square and then draw another solid black square on top of it, select both of them, and then use one of the Pathfinder tools, the minus front, I end up with exactly the same thing. The outer square is black. The inner square also shows up as being black because the inner square is actually just a hole that's been punched into the black object. So it's considering the black outline to be an object. What appears to be a white square in the center is not actually a white square. It's simply the hole, simply the hole inside the middle of the object. All right, I'm having trouble getting hold of this thing. Let's do it this way. And I want to demonstrate an important difference here. If I draw another object, and I'm just going to give that some random color, and now I'm going to go to Object, Arrange, Send to Back. You can see the difference. With the objects that were created using image trace, the shape in the center is a separate object that I can add color to. Originally it was a pure white object, but you see that the inside of the square is opaque, whereas in these other cases, this one that I created by outlining the stroke, this one I created using the minus front Pathfinder, in both cases the white square in the middle is not really white. It is simply a hole within the black square. So in order to be able to colorize the interior of this object, I somehow need to separate the inner object from the outer object. I want this inner square to no longer be a hole punched out of the interior of that black shape. Instead, I want to convert that into a separate shape that I can somehow colorize. So whenever you outline a stroke like this and create this enclosed shape where this white square is a hole punched out of the black square, or if you were to use something like the minus front Pathfinder and punch a hole out of a square, Illustrator is creating something known as a compound object. I'm going to select this square. I'm going to go up to the Object menu, And down here, there's actually a little submenu called Compound Path. And you'll notice it says Make, but it also says Release. The fact that Release is actually something that an option that I can select here, it's not grayed out, is telling me that the object that's currently selected is a compound path. And if I select this Release option, it now splits this object up into its component parts so that the square in the center is no longer a hole punched out of the black shape. I can now select the square in the center independently and give it a color. And I can now select the black outline around the outside and give that a different color. So when you create artwork using the outline strokes method, you may have to split up the component objects to separate the interior of any object from its outline by using that compound path release. I'll do the same thing over here with this object that I created using -front. Go to Object, Compound Path. Once again, Release is available as an option because that is in fact a compound path. Click Release, and you see how it separates it into its component shapes, which I can then colorize independently. So let me show you this with a couple of real examples. So here is the colon that I've shown you before. And this, as you may recall from the previous video, this was originally an ink drawing that I converted using the live trace command. The image on the left has already been converted from the scanned JPEG into an actual vector shape. So if I select it, you can see that it's already vectors. Because this was created using the live trace option, live tracing a JPEG file, it's already separated the different objects into white shapes for the interior and black shapes for the outline. So it's very easy for me to select the large interior white shape, take my eyedropper tool, and I've already got a color drawn here for the colon color, and very easily apply that to the entire white shape in the interior of this object. Now you might notice there are a couple of little tiny pieces that weren't attached to the rest of that big white shape, but it's easy to select those and give them a color. Now when I first started doing this many years ago, of live tracing artwork and colorizing it, I used to leave the outlines as being solid black. And more recently I've decided that the solid black outlines are just, I don't know, it's too much of a contrast between the colored fill and that solid black outline. So what I've been doing more recently is, instead of a solid black outline, using a dark brown. And I think that is a little bit less of a stark contrast. Now there's still some black shapes in here because a lot of these little internal details are still black shapes. So I'd have to go around and select all of these little details as well and colorize them that same brown color. Now I also wanted to show you over here on the right, there was a different version of this colon image that I showed at one point in this series of videos, where I had left a little break in the ascending colon just to emphasize how that transverse colon is sitting out in front of the ascending colon. Same thing over here where the transverse colon is sitting out in front of the edge of the descending colon. Those little gaps are going to create a real problem, because if I try to select the interior of this shape, it's actually just selecting the black outline here. There's no way for me to select the interior of that white shape. See, when I colorize that object, it's colorizing it with what's supposed to be the fill color. Because of those little gaps, the white area inside the colon is not one large continuous shape. So you have to be very careful if you do plan to try to color in the interior of an object, to make sure that there's a continuous solid outline that goes all the way around the artwork, so that the interior shape, such as this white shape, is actually completely distinct and not, not connected to the empty space outside, as you see here. But other than that one little exception, other than this idea that you have to be very careful to completely enclose the interior white shapes, colorizing artwork that's been produced using this live trace method is really quite simple. And here you see a finished piece that I modified from that original live traced version of the colon. Not only is this one colorized, but I also went in and added some additional shading to the haustra. And all of these little highlights and shadows you see are done using object blend. So there's an object blend for the highlight and an object blend for the shadow on each individual haustra. I also went back in and separated the Taenia coli from the rest of the colon, so that I could give that a little bit different color. This is actually just a separate shape that I drew with the pen tool. So I think this has a real natural, organic quality to it. Now here we have an example that was done by drawing line weights or drawing strokes with variable line weight, outlining the strokes, and then merging them together with the Pathfinder tool. So this is an example of the outline strokes method. If I select the this man here, it's all grouped into one big shape because I used the Unite Pathfinder command. So I had drawn all of these strokes with the pen tool, converted them to outlines using the outline stroke command, and then merged them all into one great big object using the Pathfinder command. Then I went through and tapered the ends of lines, as you can see here, and added snodgrasses. But right now, this is just one great big complex shape, and it is a compound path, like I was just demonstrating earlier. If I were to try to select, say, the inside of this guy's leg, you see in the color palette, it shows up as still being a black shape because it's actually a hole punched through the middle of the black outline behind the body. And I can confirm that by drawing another colored object, sending it to the back, and you can see that that colored object shows through all of those white spaces. So the white spaces are not really white, they're simply holes punched out of the black shape that goes all the way around this guy's body. So the only way that I can colorize the different parts of this guy's body independently from one another is I have to release the compound path. So I'm going to select the entire guy, all of the objects and shapes, go to Object, Compound Path, and once again, Compound Path is available for me to select. It's not grayed out, so it's telling me that this is a compound path that can be released. And of course, everything turns solid black. So then I would have to select individual objects and colorize them one at a time. So, for example, I mentioned just a minute ago that I used to use black outlines on these colorized line art pieces, but I tend now to use more of a dark brown. I just think it looks better. So I might do something like 40, 50, 60. So now there's a dark brown outline around everything. Makes it a little bit easier to see the other shapes, to select them as well. So let me select this part of the leg. I can give that a skin color. I'm going to get rid of that black and do something like 15 and 15. I could then select other objects that would be filled with that same skin color, like the face, the arm. Use my eyedropper tool and pick that up. Now, for some reason, the interior of this part of the leg, this part of the thigh and calf, is not showing up. Let me fill it with that color. Sometimes something that happens when you split up compound paths is that some of the objects end up getting sent to the back in kind of an unpredictable way. So that object is still there. I just filled it with the flesh color, but it must be behind the brown shape. So I'm going to try to use Object, Arrange, Bring to Front, and sure enough, that worked. So then I could select, the hair, object, and give that a little bit different color. I mean, that could be, a real dark brown. Notice that the white of his eye is also turned black, so I'd go back and make that white. There are some other little detail shapes, like the shapes on the nose, the shape around the eye, this little shape up in the eyebrow. These should also be colorized the same brown as the outline, so I'll just use my eyedropper to colorize those. I might give the iris of his eye a color. Let's assume that he's got blue eyes. Give it kind of a blue-gray. We can colorize the shirt. I'm just going to pick a color. I know I don't normally do this, but wow, that's bright. The shorts. There's a space here, which is actually supposed to be a hole, so we're just going to fill that in with white. And then I could do the socks and the shoes too, of course. And I have a different version of that same thing down here. So let me just show you a couple of other examples of colorized line art that I've created. Here's one created for a medical terminology textbook many years ago. This is another one that actually started out as an ink drawing. I drew the teeth in ink specifically for this purpose. I wasn't going to use the ink drawing for anything other than simply scanning it in and using the live trace function or image trace function to convert it into a vector drawing specifically for this purpose. And then here is a large collection of artwork, most of which was created using the outline strokes method. None of these started out as ink drawings. These were all drawn just by drawing paths with the pen tool, giving them variable line weight, outlining their strokes, and then merging them together. This particular page is actually my entire collection of images related to the brain and central nervous system. I created this whole collection of brains for a book called Guyton and Hall Textbook of Medical Physiology. And so I knew that this book had lots and lots of brains in it. It had some anterior brains. It had a lot of lateral brains. It had some sagittal sections of brains and some inferior views of the brain. So I Some of these I had already drawn previously, so I was able to just repurpose them. Others I drew brand new specifically for this book. But I just created this whole sort of clip art file of brains so that as I was going through the artwork for this book, I was able to just, every time I needed a brain, I just opened up this file, and hopefully I had the correct view. And I mean, I think you can tell that I've got a lot of different views of the brain here. So there was a pretty good chance that I was going to have the correct view. So if I zoom in more closely on some of these, you can see that this is done using that outline strokes method. So all of the outlines you see here were just strokes drawn with the pen tool, outlined, merged together using Pathfinder, and then I had to use the release compound path to separate the interior of the brain from the outline. Now in this case, you notice something else you can do is you can even add a gradient to one of these shapes. So I added this gradient, and you can then select the gradient tool and use the gradient tool to reposition exactly where the gradient is located in the brain. You know, these are some of the most complex ones, drawing an inferior view of the brain and then adding the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves were added later just using the pen tool. The cranial nerves don't have any kind of variable line weight to them. But the rest of the brain that you see here was done using the outline strokes method. And you can see there's a bunch of gradients that have been applied to these different shapes. So that's it for colorizing line art. I love this method because I love the look of it. You know, I just think something like these brains with the variable line weight just look so much more natural and organic than they would be if I had just drawn the entire thing just using a pen tool with strokes of uniform line weight. And one of the beauties of going to all this trouble, even though it was rather time consuming to you know, to draw each and every one of these brains using that variable stroke method, once it's done, you then have that to use over and over and over again. And so I can reuse these over and over again, not only for this one particular physiology textbook, but anytime I need a brain for anything, I've just got it sitting right here. I can just come in and select it, copy and paste it,